Now, to the war in Ukraine, the Russians have been humiliated there, their army smashed, and Russian President Vladimir Putin is so desperate that it's just upped the stakes to actually increase, quite deliberately, the chance of nuclear war. He's rushing through a referendum, a sham vote really, in the parts of Ukraine still occupied by Russia to turn them into Russian territory instead, so that any attack by Ukrainians with Western help will be sold as an attack on the Russian motherland. And a couple of hours ago, Putin gave an address to the Russian nation, saying he was calling up 300,000 more Russians to the army.
I stress it is partial mobilization. Only those who are currently in reserve will be conscripted, and also those who served in the army have certain military professions and will be always given additional military training, taking into account the special military operation.
300,000 more conscripts, that's what's that? 5 times more than the Australian army? Putin also warned that if any foreign power did threaten Russian territory, he could hit them with nuclear bombs.
We will certainly use all the means available to us, and I'm not bluffing.
But why has Ukraine been so successful in beating the Russians? Because really, Russia is nearly 4 times more people than Ukraine. It's got an economy 10 times bigger, vastly more experienced army. Now, of course, the weapons poured into Ukraine by the West, they've made a critical difference, but it's not just that. Now, one of the most brilliant books on history I've read is this one, Why the West Has Won, by American historian Victor Davis Hanson. Highly recommend it. It helps you understand exactly what's going on and what we might face with China. Now, Victor Davis Hanson, he went through the great battles of the past between East and West, the Greeks against the Persians, the Romans against Hannibal, the French against Arab invaders, the US against Japan at Midway, to work out why the West had won. And his finding is so important for today. He said the difference essentially is freedom. A society that is free, like ours, is more likely to have soldiers who can think for themselves on the battlefield and adapt faster than soldiers who must follow the orders of a tyrant, sit there waiting for the tyrant to call. And freedom in an economy is also important. Capitalism is important. People are more likely to innovate when they're free, and that includes inventing better weapons and getting richer. And also, when a democracy does decide to go to war, particularly in its defence, it tends to be all in. And these are important things to consider when we're looking at how Russia fights or fails to, but also how the huge Chinese army, a dictatorship's army, would fight if a new world war does now break out. Joining me is Victor Davis Hanson, a distinguished fellow of the Center for American Greatness and a classicist and historian at Stanford's Hoover Institution. Victor Davis Hanson, thank you so much indeed for your time. I've mentioned the conclusions in your book, Why the West Has Won. Talking about those, can you extend your analysis to how it is that Russia has been so humiliated in Ukraine?
Well, I think that they had used a paradigm in Ossetia and Chechnya and the borderlands of the Donbass in 2014 and the Crimea, but they had never really attempted a full-scale absorption of a large country. I mean, Ukraine is huge. It's not Chechnya. It's 30 times larger. And so I don't think they had any idea that as an expeditionary force, and I will say that we all remember that this, whether the Tsarist or the Soviet or the Russian Federation, whether they go into the Russo-Japanese War or the Winter War in Finland in 1939 or Poland in 21 or Afghanistan, they don't do well when they're outside of the borders of Russia. So I think they were wildly optimistic about their own capability, and they had deprecated the ability of Ukraine to fight back. And they thought there was this huge asymmetry, and there was. They have 30 times the territory, 3.5 times the population, 10 times the GDP, but they do not have more capability and wherewithal than Europe and the Western world, United States combined. And that's now showing up that Europe and countries that are sympathetic to the West, the United States, are pouring in sophisticated weapons. And I don't think the Russians had any idea that we would be a repository for Ukrainian weapons and supplies and cash.
But what strikes me, one of the things that struck me very strongly and reminded me of your book, is that we're seeing evidence of Russian troops not being able to adapt, seems to be micromanaged from the very top, some of the strategic decisions, not much flexibility in the lower ranks with the officers lower down, as compared to Ukraine, which seems to be fighting as a very democratic army where people are licensed to think for themselves on the front lines. And this seems to have been, if not the most important thing, certainly a huge influence in the conduct of this war.
Yeah, I think the last decade, the Ukrainians have become westernized. And I mean that not in a chauvinistic way, but they have looked toward the EU, toward NATO, the United States, and they've had a lot of cross-fertilization with European, Western, British former Commonwealth officers. And I think they've sort of adopted an entire new paradigm. And that's on top of the fact that they are defenders on their own ground. And the Russians are in, again, a historical contradiction, because when they go into other countries, they don't have the same morale as if anybody dares to go into Mother Russia. I am a little apprehensive, though, because in this country, there are people who are advocating further attacks, where they're already attacking depots and supply centers along the border inside Russia. But there are a lot of American bipartisan strategic analysts who say, we can sink the whole Black Sea Fleet, or we can go 50 miles into Russia and destroy all of their capability to supply the border war. And I think if that happens, Putin will recalibrate this war as an attack on Mother Russia, and then I think the morale and the equilibrium will change a little bit. And of course, he has under his control over 6,500 nuclear weapons. So I think we've got to be very careful about how this ends. And I think a lot of us in the West, in the zeal that we're so proud of the Ukrainians and we're empathetic, they were attacked, they're flexible, they're imaginative, they're brave. Putin's corrupt, he's a killer, except as our president called him. But nevertheless, there has to be an ending short of nuclear war. And a lot of our agendas are mutually exclusive. If we want every single Russian out of all of the Russian-speaking borderlands, and we don't want them to have the ability to do it again, and we want to punish them, as our Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, said, to the degree they won't be capable of this again, then we're talking about a level of intensification against a nuclear power that we have not seen since World War II.
I think that's absolutely correct. You do not want to change this from an unpopular foreign war for Russia to a war for the motherland. That would be a completely different thing for many Russians, I should imagine. But looking at how poorly Russia has fought in Ukraine and the cultural factors at work there, not just the logistics, how do you expect China then to fight when its soldiers are working for a totalitarian dictatorship? And I can't help reading your book to make the connection with the Persian soldiers who were disastrously defeated in Greece more than 2,000 years ago.
I think we've had a very naive view of the Chinese military, and that is we feel that because they have made such leaps and bounds economically, that's commiserately true of their military. But if we look at recent history, whether their invasion of Vietnam in the 1970s or how they performed during the Korean War, when they suffered over 1 million casualties, probably deaths, to U.S. and UN troops in Korea. And that's one of the reasons they didn't intervene during our Vietnam War, is that they suffer some of the same problems that Russia does, not to the same degree, but they're a top-down, rigid system. And if they were going to go into Taiwan, I think they would have the same sort of problems that the Russians are having. They would be against a supply chain of Western arms, intelligence, high-tech availability to the Taiwanese, and the Taiwanese may well fight as well. They would lose probably because they're so small compared to the Chinese, but they would take a terrible toll on the world economy and China. And I think China now is looking at this very carefully, and they want Putin to win and to establish a precedent that an autocratic big country can absorb a former federated or akin province, and that would be a good paradigm for them. But they're not sure. They look at things and they're bothered, and they think, you know what, maybe we are more like Russia and Taiwan could be like Ukraine, so let's just hold off until we see how this thing plays out.
That's exactly why I think this is such a crucial war in Ukraine to win, because it is, for me, the first battle of potentially World War III. But for soldiers to fight well, Victor Davis Hanson, they must have pride in the country they are fighting for, even in a democracy. Now, does it worry you that we in the West have a culture of self-loathing that is being spread by the intelligentsia, certainly of all the English-speaking countries and many of the non-English-speaking ones in Europe?
Yeah, it does. I think that it's not unique to Australia or the United States. It's a Western disease, and it's not new. I mean, it was discussed. It was discussed in classical literature. There was a whole series of Roman chroniclers, Suetonius, Tacitus, Petronius, the novelist. And it's this age-old challenge that the only system that works of free market capitalism and private property and individualism under the aegis of constitutional government creates an enormous amount of affluence and leisure, but that can become what the Romans called luxus or luxury or decadence. And it's incumbent upon all of us that we understand that what's legal to do may not be ethical or moral to do in our own lives. And you have to have some ties to community and tradition and religion and all of the mysteries of life, as well as just the affluence and leisure. And I think we're all worried because we are at war with our past. The people who gave us this wonderful life, these wonderful institutions in the West, we seem to condemn them by the standards of the present, even though privately we know that none of us could survive what your ancestors put up with developing Australia and the death and misery they had to put up with, my ancestors here out west. And yet we give them no benefit of the doubt. And so I'm very worried. History doesn't say to us, you're an affluent Melbourne, or you're an affluent San Francisco, or you're an affluent Paris, and therefore everything is going to be fine for you. You're not capable of decline or fall. They just simply say, if you don't believe that you're better than the alternative, or if you don't believe that you can be good without having to be perfect, and if you don't believe that your culture is better than the other alternatives, then there's no reason for you to continue. And that's happened to a lot of Western cultures in the past, starting from the very beginning with Greece and Rome. And so we have to dispense with this utopian idea that we're going to be gods rather than just humans that have foibles and are frail, but we're better than the alternative. And we have to honor the people who gave us this wonderful tradition. If we don't believe that, there's a lot of people far worse than us that will take advantage of us, and it will be for the detriment of the entire world.
I think it's interesting in that context that in Britain, where they've had this culture of self-loathing being preached, the nation thrilled to all these scenes of the royal funeral in which the military figured absolutely front and centre, and people loved it. So maybe, I don't know, maybe the ordinary people understand what the intelligentsia does not, where the great in Great Britain, some of it came from. Victor Davis Hanson, thank you so much indeed for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
Like I said, Victor Davis Hanson's book, Why the West Has Won, invaluable reading. Highly recommend it.